He was beaten and left for dead on his living room floor.
It's hard to wrap your mind around the brutality.
It was absolutely the most bloodiest scene I'd ever seen.
Literally just bone-crushing blows just scattered his teeth around the room.
How did a devoted man of God find himself on the wrong end of an assassin's sledgehammer?
He had given his life to Christ and was studying to be in the ministry.
It didn't make sense.
Who could have done this?
The investigation reveals more than one skeleton hiding in the closet.
He had been involved in some drug deals.
There was a contract on his life.
Did a rival from his past come back to settle a score?
If you're dealing drugs and at the same time providing state's evidence, you're running a risk.
Things were starting to close in.
Police, open up!
Or is there more to the story?
They were in all kinds of ungodly behavior.
There was trouble with the ATF.
You know, he made some enemies.
It's a pretty big red flag.
I said, wow, this person is one of the filthiest animals we got on the face of this.
December 7th, 2003. The holiday season is in full swing in Lakewood, Colorado, a small town nestled in the foothills of the Rocky Mountains.
Lakewood is really part of the Denver metro area, between Denver and the mountains.
Lakewood is a pretty typical American suburb. You have the views of the mountains to the west, a lot of parks and bike trails.
December, it's full of that nice Christmas feel. We have families coming together, just celebrating the holidays.
But around 9 o'clock that night, Christmas cheer is the last thing on the mind of one Lakewood woman when she hears a fight break out in the apartment next door.
911, where's emergency?
Hello, yes. It sounds like someone's getting beat up in my neighbor's apartment. Please.
She heard significant fighting going on, banging, crashing, bumping. So she called 911.
The woman tells the operator that a young married couple lives in the apartment, Alvin and Darlene Spears.
She could tell that it was getting pretty violent.
She even hears a male voice saying, "Why are you doing this to me?" And then it goes quiet.
It's getting really bad.
She said, somebody need to come out here and check on her.
By the time police arrive, there's no sign of an active disturbance.
They can hear something inside that they recognize as heavy breathing, and they yell and knock very loud.
Lakewood police, open up!
Darlene Spears is a person who opens the door.
You have to help him. He's in here.
She is just covered in blood. Alvin Spears is on the floor, moaning and groaning in pain.
There was blood everywhere.
He's barely clinging to consciousness.
What happened?
He was just
Who did this?
holding on by a thread.
Darlene and Alvin Spears Jr. were new to Colorado.
Alvin and Darlene are from Baton Rouge, Louisiana, and they had been living in Baton Rouge, Louisiana just recently before moving to Lakewood.
Growing up in the Deep South, Alvin was a dedicated athlete and a devoted servant of God.
I had 5 sons. Alvin was my first. He was a very good kid. I had him in a private Christian school where he played basketball, he played football.
He grew up in the church. He was in the church 3 or 4 days a week.
He was a clean-cut kid.
Alvin always loved his hometown, not least because it's the place where he met the love of his life.
Alvin had wanted me to meet his girlfriend. So I told him to bring her by and let me check her out. And to me, looked like that was love there.
People thought that they were just the nicest, friendliest, lovely couple.
And it was like about 8, 9 months later, his mother and his grandmother put on a wedding in Baton Rouge.
But married life presented its fair share of challenges.
Starting out, the couple had struggled to get by.
However, Alvin was the type of guy who knew how to make the best of a bad situation.
Both of them had an entrepreneur spirit. They were really concerned about creating opportunities for themselves.
He had a business in Baton Rouge. He sold these expensive chrome wheels.
His shop was a go-to place if that is what you wanted on your car.
At the same time, Darlene ran her own business out of the back of Alvin's shop.
Darlene was running a lingerie shop out of the same building.
They were both carving out their own niches, and together as entrepreneurs, they were pretty successful.
But then in 2000, Alvin and Darlene faced a devastating setback.
Their business had been hit with a fire, and they were having a lot of financial troubles trying to deal with it.
Finally, when they started to feel like they were making the money that they wanted to make, both of their businesses were destroyed.
The total loss of their businesses forced Alvin and Darlene to make some difficult decisions.
The couple tried to rebuild, but it was too hard.
That really prompted them to seek out starting a new life.
They wanted to come to Colorado to get a fresh start.
Almost as soon as they arrived in Lakewood, Alvin and Darlene knew they'd made the right decision.
Alvin told me that he was working for a milk company delivering milk to schools.
Darlene was working in an office and doing well.
Everything was really coming together for them.
In their new home, they also experienced a spiritual reawakening.
They joined a church, and Alvin started recording Christian rap and was studying to be a minister.
It's one thing to join a church as a member, but Alvin was one of the very few that decided he wanted to take things a step further to pursue ministry.
But now, just as the couple was finding their footing in Colorado, Lakewood police have found Alvin Spears Jr. on the floor of their apartment, barely clinging to life.
He's in here. You have to help him.
Alvin is moaning in pain, and there's a bloody towel wrapped around his head.
They called to get medical help right away. They were hoping they could still save him.
And when they asked Darlene what happened, they're stunned by her response.
She says, I guess the drug dealers from Louisiana finally caught up with me.
Less than a year after moving across the country to Lakewood, Colorado, Alvin and Darlene Spears' decision to make a fresh start was beginning to pay off.
Darlene had a pretty professional job, and Alvin wanted to be a minister, and he was doing some Christian music.
They were trying to make a new life for themselves. And it seems like everything's going to be better in the future.
But now Lakewood police have responded to a concerned neighbor's 911 call and found a disturbing scene inside the couple's apartment.
Darlene says those drug dealers from back home finally caught up to Alvin.
Drug dealers from Louisiana.
When paramedics arrive, it's clear to them that Alvin had endured a severe beating.
Whoever did this put a massive beat down on Alvin. He had blunt force trauma to the head.
Alvin wasn't just beaten, he was stabbed, and he was stabbed brutally and repeatedly. So he is taken off to the hospital where he has to undergo immediate surgery.
While Alvin is rushed to the emergency room, Lakewood detectives arrive on the scene to begin evaluating the evidence.
When I first opened the door, it was absolutely the most bloodiest scene I'd ever seen.
The entire apartment was covered with blood. It was absolutely grisly. It was just horrific. But looking at it with the crime techs from the Lakewood Police Department, they said, this really tells a story.
One of the first pieces of evidence that grabs the investigators' attention is a bloody sledgehammer on the living room floor.
From what we put together, the very first thing that occurred was a strike to his mouth from a 4-pound sledgehammer.
It's just bone-crushing blows.
What is even more disturbing is there are several of Alvin's teeth on the floor.
I suppose that if you would strike someone in the mouth with a sledgehammer, you don't expect him to get up, but he did.
The evidence shows that after that initial blow, Alvin put up a valiant fight for his life.
There were handprints on the walls.
He's trying to get to the door, and then as he reaches the door, he drops to his knees, and there's another blow to the top of his head with the sledgehammer.
At some point, Alvin even tried to shield himself under a desk.
The desk shows signs of damage from the attackers continuing to beat the desk that Alvin is trying to protect himself under.
Failing to beat Alvin into submission, it looks like his attacker eventually decided to change tactics.
Detectives also find a knife with a broken handle on the floor.
He stabbed multiple times. His throat was superficially sliced.
And he finally dropped right in front of the front door.
With no obvious leads on the attacker's identity, the detectives decide to turn their focus to the sole witness of the crime, Alvin's wife, Darlene.
When Darlene arrives at the station, she's still covered in blood, and detectives arrange for her to get new clothes, and they take her clothes and put them into evidence.
Darlene is distraught. They still push her, though, because they need to get to the bottom of this.
Darlene tells the detective that she and Alvin were sitting down to dinner when they heard a knock at the door.
You heard that?
And we weren't expecting any company, so I thought that was weird.
No.
That's kind of late.
Alvin goes to the door. There's a discussion back and forth between he and another man. There's a struggle, and she says that 2 men push in the door, force Alvin away from the door.
One of the men takes Darlene to a bedroom and holds her sort of captive in there, while the other one attacks Alvin.
Don't move, or you're next.
He tells her if she moves that she'll die, and then she says she hears the commotion, the struggle, the fight.
I could hear it. It was horrible. I could hear him screaming.
Darlene says that she is locked in that bedroom for about 15 minutes, and the whole time she is screaming, begging, and pleading to get out.
Eventually, Darlene realized the apartment had gone quiet.
She tries to open the door once again. Finally, the door opens.
She rushed to Alvin, who was on the floor, bleeding heavily.
The first thing she did was grab a towel and wrap it around Alvin's head to try to stop the bleeding. At that point, there was a knock at the door.
Lakewood police, open up!
She says I had to move Alvin out of the way in order to open the door for the police, and that's why I've got the blood on the front.
Oh my God!
You didn't recognize either of the men who broke in?
The police say, well, if you haven't seen them before, why do you think they were drug dealers?
She said that Alvin had gotten into some trouble back in Louisiana. He was selling drugs.
And at one point, in order to avoid a jail sentence, Alvin agreed to be an informant.
He put some people away for a long time. You know, he made some enemies.
She says that drug dealers back home had put a contract on Alvin's life.
After Alvin Spears Jr. was beaten within an inch of his life in his Lakewood, Colorado apartment, his wife Darlene told detectives that he was on the run from a ring of violent drug dealers back in Louisiana.
She said the drug dealer Baton Rouge wanted him dead because he had been a police informant.
She said that would be part of the reason they fled to Colorado.
Now, despite moving more than 1,000 miles from home, Darlene doesn't think they ran far enough.
They must have tracked us down somehow. I don't know how, but they did.
Darlene tells the detective that Alvin started dealing drugs as a young man.
And eventually, Alvin's criminal activity caught the attention of the Baton Rouge Police Department.
They picked him up. They were going to throw the book at him.
But rather than going to jail for a long time, Alvin agreed to turn informant.
He helped take down several big drug dealers in the Baton Rouge area.
But the more Alvin cooperated with the police, the more exposed he felt.
According to Darlene, all of Alvin's informing on other drug dealers made him a marked man.
From my understanding, they found a hidden microphone on Alvin, and they got a hit out on him.
So they made up their minds to start over somewhere new, somewhere far away from the people who wanted Alvin dead.
This led to the decision to go ahead and move to Lakewood, Colorado.
Since relocating, Darlene says things have been getting better.
Once they got to Colorado, everything changed. They were trying to put all that behind them.
But none of that mattered to the men he crossed back in Baton Rouge.
Everything was going good until there came that knock on the door.
But the guys who attacked Alvin, they didn't look familiar to you?
No, I'd never seen them before.
She just said she did not know. But police, they're still hopeful that they can get some answers from Alvin.
However, that hope is dashed when the police receive a call from the hospital where Alvin is undergoing surgery.
They got word that he had passed. Doctors were just unable to save him.
I get a phone call. It was Darlene on the phone, and she said, I called to tell you your son got killed last night. I went outside just devastated, just messed me up.
Now the investigator's assault case has become a homicide. And based on everything he's heard so far, he thinks the key to solving it could lie in Baton Rouge.
Lakewood detectives decide that they need to take this trip to Baton Rouge.
The detectives spent a lot of time talking to the Baton Rouge police, and they certainly did know Alvin.
I did learn that, in fact, Alvin was dealing on the streets of Louisiana and that he was involved with the Baton Rouge Police Department as an informant.
But that's not all the investigator learns.
Detectives in Louisiana said that Alvin had been an informant for them, but the drug dealers that he helped them nab were just low-level street dealers.
The guys that he helped flip were pretty small time.
They weren't the kind of kingpins that could facilitate an out-of-state hit on Alvin.
That seems to call Darlene's theory about Alvin being murdered by brutal drug dealers into question. But even more concerning is why Alvin became an informant in the first place.
Darlene, it turns out, had been in trouble with the law herself.
She would buy a gun in her name, and then she would sell that gun to a known felon.
She had been implicated in an ATF investigation.
Alvin didn't become an informant to cut a sweet deal for himself. He became an informant to help Darlene.
The investigation into the brutal murder of Alvin Spears Jr. has led Colorado detectives into the heart of the bayou, where their victim supposedly racked up enemies working as an informant for the Baton Rouge Police Department.
Darlene said Alvin had come through for the police. He had assisted in them apprehending several bigger dealers out there.
But according to the Baton Rouge police, Alvin didn't cooperate with them to save his own skin. He did it to protect his wife.
Darlene was being investigated by the ATF because of some illegal gun dealing.
Since she had no criminal history, she could buy a gun and then give it to somebody who had a criminal history.
It's something Darlene conveniently forgot to mention during her interview with the Lakewood police.
Now they're wondering, why didn't Darlene tell us this part?
Facing multiple serious weapons charges, the Baton Rouge police say that Darlene's future had looked grim.
Darlene was facing some serious time. This was a felony, possibly multiple felonies.
That's actually what Alvin began turning state's evidence as an effort to work off her situation with the guns.
However, keeping his wife out of prison came at a cost.
Undercover or informant kind of work, I think common sense says that's risky.
Is it possible that one of the drug dealers Alvin sent to prison tracked him down in Colorado to exact revenge? Investigators think it's unlikely.
The drug dealers that Alvin helped to catch were low-level dealers.
And so that made them a little skeptical, too, that they weren't the kind of people that would come to Colorado and assassinate him.
But if Alvin's murder wasn't an act of retribution, what was it?
Darlene avoided charges, but this meant that they had to give up the lifestyle that they had been used to. Maybe Darlene had found a way to fill up the void that was lost by the illegal activities.
Alvin's father, Alvin Spears Sr., thinks that's exactly what happened.
I went in there and I told him the first person I wanted him to look at was Darlene.
Talking about your son's wife?
Yes, sir.
Alvin Sr. says he's had a bad feeling about Darlene almost since the day he met her.
I told my boy she's slick as a piece of glass. I can see clean through her. I said, leave her alone.
Alvin Sr. tells the investigators that he thinks drugs and guns were only the tip of the iceberg when it came to Darlene's criminal activities.
She's rotten to the core, just rotten.
Let's don't forget about the fire at their businesses.
The insurance company went ahead and paid Alvin and Darlene more than $30,000 for that fire. However, fire detectives still said they thought that fire was suspicious.
Then, after the fire, another strange incident occurred.
In Baton Rouge, I have some rental property. And they came to me and he said, Dad, can I move in your house? It wasn't a month later I received a phone call. They told me somebody had kicked the doors in and stole a lot of expensive jewelry. I didn't really buy that.
Darlene had reported a break-in at her home where like $10,000 worth of valuables were taken. And Alvin's father said she collected insurance money on it.
Alvin Sr. was suspicious about this because he said he had lived in the home for years and never had a problem.
In the story that they told me, did not sit right with me at all.
What do you think really happened?
I believe it was a fraud.
But despite suspicions, she was never charged. And from the detective's point of view, it's a big leap from insurance scams to cold-blooded murder.
You really think Darlene could be behind this?
I tell you what, I wouldn't put it past her.
Alvin wanted his marriage to work. He wanted the business to succeed. But I believe fooling with Darlene, it led to one thing to the other.
But if Alvin really was Darlene's partner in crime, then why would she want him dead?
Detectives want to know, why would Darlene kill her husband?
Hoping to learn more, detectives reach out to Alvin Jr.'s mother. And although stricken with grief, she's able to give the detectives more insight into Alvin's past.
She has heard about this contract on Alvin's life. Darlene's brother had been going around telling everyone about this.
But the story seemed a little strange.
She thinks there's another explanation for Alvin's death. She says that Alvin had been back in town a few weeks before his death.
He was going through it, you know. He opened up to me.
Alvin had confided in that he wanted to move back to Baton Rouge.
Do you know why they wanted to come home?
Not they, Alvin.
He was looking to move back to Baton Rouge alone.
Alvin was actually preparing to leave Darlene.
A detective from Lakewood, Colorado has made the long trek down to Baton Rouge to see what he can find out about the murder of Alvin Spears Jr. And now, thanks to his family, they've made a major breakthrough.
Alvin's father always thought Darlene was sort of up to no good.
And his planned to move back to Baton Rouge without Darlene.
Could Alvin's failing marriage have given his wife a reason to kill him?
Detectives are starting to have a lot of doubts about what Darlene is telling them. So they look at the finances.
You know, they were a struggling couple. They never were financially secure.
That was fine with Alvin. But what about Darlene?
By all accounts, Alvin was really sincere in wanting to hit the reset button and start over again. But with Darlene, it seems a little bit less clear.
Alvin had turned over a new leaf. He was a milkman, literally delivering milk to kids. And while this is all admirable, it doesn't bring in a lot of money.
Was Darlene ready to settle down and be a suburban Lakewood, Colorado resident? Or did she really miss the life they had before?
Based on what the investigator has learned, he thinks it's the latter.
The new situation didn't sit well with Darlene.
She missed her old life and the sort of glitz and glamour of guns and money.
But how far was she willing to go to get what she wanted?
As detectives continue to comb through Alvin and Darlene's finances, they remember something that Alvin Sr. said about insurance fraud.
Alvin's father thinks there could have been an insurance scheme going on.
I said, I need you to check and send me the insurance policy she'd have taken out on him.
And when the detective pulls the records, he can't believe what he finds.
When detectives looked into it, they found that not only had Darlene taken out an insurance policy on Alvin's life, she had taken out multiple policies.
They find one policy that came from Alvin's job. They find another that Alvin and Darlene took out together. And then they find 6 more that Darlene took out on her own.
In the months up to Alvin's death, there were approximately $365,000 worth of life insurance taken out by Darlene, listing Darlene as the sole beneficiary.
And it looks like those policies were taken out behind Alvin's back.
If the policy is for under $100,000, then they can just be applied for in the mail without a doctor's signature, without an exam. And we had handwriting experts look at those applications, and the signatures didn't look like Alvin's. It looked like somebody else had signed his name.
I don't believe that Alvin was aware of any of them.
We couldn't actually show that Darlene had filled them out, but she was the beneficiary, and the fact that she'd gotten them from different companies with just under the $100,000 limit, that really seemed to be the key.
Maybe when Darlene realized her marriage was coming to an end, she decided to cash in.
This is a lot of money for Darlene, who has been struggling financially. Detectives start to think, could this be the motive?
When the detectives reach out to the insurance companies providing the policies, even more damning information comes to light.
Darlene has already contacted 3 of the insurers.
She almost immediately started trying to cash out shortly after Alvin was killed.
As suspicious as that looks, on its own, it's not enough to arrest Darlene for murder.
Darlene was not charged at that point. She was certainly a suspect, but there just wasn't quite enough evidence to piece it all together.
But when a call comes in from the crime lab, the last piece of the puzzle finally falls into place.
They find that the blood on Darlene's clothes was not really consistent with what the story she told.
Darlene claimed that she got her husband's blood on her clothes when she pulled him out of the way to let the police into their apartment. But the evidence says something else.
Darlene says she was shut inside of a bedroom, but analysis of the blood splatter on Darlene's clothing showed that it was medium velocity blood splatter, meaning she had to be in the same room at the same time that this crime was happening.
Her story was that she moved Alvin out of the way, and those were not the spatter patterns. It had spatter patterns on it, indicative of someone who was close to the bloody object when the blood was expelled.
Which means Darlene's story must be a lie.
She was standing next to Alvin when he was getting beat.
If not, swinging the weapon or using that knife herself.
Lakewood, Colorado police have zeroed in on Darlene Spears as the prime suspect in the murder of her husband, Alvin, after discovering that she'd taken out multiple life insurance policies on him right before he was killed.
She'd taken out 6 insurance policies on him.
It did not appear that Alvin had anything to do with those. So those insurance policies definitely explained, I think, what was going on.
But all the detective has are his suspicions, until he receives a call from the crime lab.
Darlene said she hadn't been in the room while the beating was taking place, but the test results tell a different story.
She had blood spatter that wasn't the kind of contact blood spatter that you would get if you were pushing a bloody body. It was being there when somebody was getting hit.
Even more telling is the blood on the back of Darlene's shirt.
They call it cast-off blood spatter down her back, which shows that would happen if you're either with a knife or a sledgehammer going like this.
Every time she swings that sledgehammer back, the blood splatter is coming off of that hammer and onto the back of her shirt.
If that wasn't enough, there are also signs that Darlene wiped a bloody knife on her shirt.
There was another blood stain on her right sleeve, and that was what they call a transfer pattern.
You could see the butterfly pattern of the knife.
All of this evidence points to Darlene was beating and stabbing her husband herself. She wasn't just an innocent bystander.
And now, the detective finally has the evidence he needs to arrest her for it.
When I received the warrant for her arrest, she was at a work conference at one of the local convention centers here in Lakewood. So we went to that place, and at the opportune moment, I arrested her. She looked me straight in the eyes and said, "I've been expecting you."
I thought that was an odd reaction. It was just another little piece added to the whole picture to show that she was guilty.
She immediately asked for an attorney, and she's never spoken to me since then.
Even without a statement from Darlene, the investigators have everything they need to charge her with murder.
She was charged with first-degree murder, and she was also charged with conspiracy to commit first-degree murder.
All the time I knew, but when the detective called me and told me that he had made her arrest, it was bittersweet. I said, wow, how could she do this? How could she do it?
That's what everyone wants to know when Darlene's trial begins in February of 2006.
The prosecution says the reason for Darlene killing Alvin is a reason as old as time, pure greed.
The only motive clearly was the insurance money.
She would collect almost $400,000.
As an informant, Alvin put his life on the line to save Darlene from prison. In turn, she repaid him with a sledgehammer to the skull.
When Alvin sat down for dinner that night, he did not realize that that would be his last meal.
There you go.
Thank you, baby. It looks delicious.
Enjoy.
As he was distracted, prosecutors say that is when Darlene struck.
The first blow left Alvin severely injured, but it didn't take him out all the way, and he staggered around the living room trying to get away from Darlene.
Why are you doing this to me? Stop! Please!
Darlene is bludgeoning him again and again and again.
At some point, she ran and got a kitchen knife to finish the job.
Alvin was beaten, stabbed, his throat was cut. It was horrible.
By the time the attack was over, Alvin was barely holding on.
You wonder what was going through his mind as he's fighting for his last breath, trying to stay alive while this person's trying to end it.
But then, a knock at the door.
Lakewood police, open up!
Darlene likely didn't realize how loud this vicious attack was. She didn't expect the neighbor to call 911. So when police arrived, she had to come up with something quickly.
He's in here.
She went right into the role of playing a distraught wife.
But just like Alvin's father, the jury is able to see through Darlene's lies.
The jury found her guilty of both counts of first-degree murder and conspiracy to commit murder.
At the end, I had the victim impact speech, and I laid it on her. I told the judge, I want you to hang this woman high. Gave a 5-minute recess. We came back and he hung her high. She got life in penitentiary with no parole, where she's going to take her last breath.
Darlene may have gotten the punishment she deserved, but there's nothing anyone can do to turn back the clock and stop her from taking the life of a man who was doing his best to make right with the world and with God.
Alvin, no matter what he had done in the past, he didn't deserve to die like this. No one does.
He was trying to turn over a new leaf, had given his life to Christ, and was studying to be in the ministry.
Alvin was a swell kid, had everything going for him. Just took a wrong turn and cost him his life.
On the night of October 16th, 1970, 16-year-old Pamela Lynn Conyers drove away from Glen Burnie High School and into a darkness that would eventually stretch across more than 5 decades. She was not running away. She was not disappearing by choice. She was simply going to the shopping center. A routine errand. A few miles. A normal Friday night. Then Pamela vanished. For the people who knew her, that was the moment everything changed. One minute she was a high school student, a daughter, a friend, a girl with an ordinary future waiting somewhere beyond the weekend. The next, she had become the center of a desperate search that would eventually turn into one of Maryland's most haunting cold cases. And for more than half a century, one question remained suspended over and Arundel County. Who killed Pamela Conyers? The answer would not come from the original investigators. It would not come from a confession. It would not come from a witness walking into a police station decades later. It would come from something Pamela's killer could never have anticipated. DNA. But before that breakthrough, there was only a 16-year-old girl who did not come home. October 16th, 1970. Pamela had been at Glen Burnie High School, where the atmosphere was typical of a Friday afternoon. There had been a pep rally. Students were thinking about the weekend. The ordinary rhythm of teenage life was still intact. Pamela was part of that world. Then she left. Later that evening, she drove the family car to the Herondale shopping area to run an errand. Investigators would eventually establish that this was the last known place where she was seen alive. The shopping center was not some remote wilderness. It was familiar. Public. Ordinary. And that was what made what happened next so difficult to comprehend. Pamela did not return home. At first, there was uncertainty. Then concern. Then fear. Her family reported her missing too, and Arundel County Police. The search began. Officers had something to work with. They knew Pamela's age. They knew what she had been driving. They knew where she had gone. They knew that a teenage girl had left for what should have been a brief errand and had somehow disappeared. But every hour that passed without finding her changed the nature of the investigation. A missing person case can begin with hope. Maybe she had gone somewhere unexpectedly. Maybe the car had broken down. Maybe she was with friends. Maybe she would walk through the door. But those possibilities become harder to believe as the clock moves forward. For Pamela's family, the waiting was unbearable. For investigators, the clock was becoming an enemy. Then came the discovery of the car. 3 days after Pamela disappeared, on October 19th, the vehicle was found in a wooded area near Mountain Road and what was then a construction area associated with Maryland Route 100. The car was there. Pamela was not. That single discovery transformed the search. Because now there was a physical location. A vehicle. A possible crime scene. And somewhere beyond it, the unanswered question of where Pamela had gone. The following day, October 20th, the search produced the discovery everyone had feared. Pamela's body was found a short distance from the abandoned vehicle. The 16-year-old girl who had left home 3 nights earlier was dead. Authorities determined that she had been strangled. Her death was ruled a homicide. The case that had begun as a disappearance had become a murder investigation. And suddenly, the quiet landscape around a developing highway became the center of an investigation that would haunt Maryland for generations. There was no modern forensic database, no investigative genetic genealogy, no national network of digital records waiting to be searched. There were investigators, physical evidence, interviews, photographs, fingerprints, laboratory testing, and instinct. And somewhere in that evidence was information that would remain invisible for decades. Pamela's killer had left something behind. Investigators did not know it yet. Technology did not exist to reveal it. But time would preserve it. The investigation moved forward. Detectives had to reconstruct Pamela's final hours. They had to understand where she had been, who might have seen her, what happened to the vehicle, and how she ended up dead near an area that was then undergoing construction. The answers were not waiting neatly in one place. They were scattered. A vehicle. A body. A timeline. Witness recollections. Physical evidence. And questions. Lots of questions. What happened after Pamela left the shopping center? Did she know the person who killed her? Was she approached by a stranger? Did someone follow her? How did her vehicle end up where it was found? And most importantly, how could someone commit such a crime and then disappear into ordinary life? At the time, investigators could not see the future. They could not know that the man eventually identified as a suspect would still be alive for decades after Pamela's death. They could not know that he would eventually die in Virginia in 2018. They could not know that the evidence collected from Pamela and the scene would survive long enough to outlive the man investigators would eventually name. And they certainly could not know that a scientific revolution would one day transform the meaning of biological evidence. For years, the case remained active. Then time began doing what time does to old investigations. Memories faded. People moved. Records disappeared into archives. Investigators retired. Generations changed. The road itself changed. The landscape changed. And Pamela remained 16. That is one of the cruelest facts about a cold case. Everyone else gets older. The victim does not. Pamela never got to graduate. Never got to leave high school behind. Never got to discover what adulthood would look like. Never got to become someone older than 16. Her classmates did. The people who remembered her did. The investigators did. And eventually the person authorities would identify as a suspect grew old. The case became a historical mystery. Then, decades later, forensic science began catching up with the evidence. DNA had changed criminal investigations. But DNA alone was not enough. The crucial question was how investigators could use old biological evidence when there was no conventional database match. That was where forensic genetic genealogy entered the story. The concept was revolutionary. Instead of simply asking whether an unknown DNA profile matched someone already in a criminal database, investigators could use genetic information to identify possible relatives and construct family connections. The past could suddenly become searchable in a completely different way. Evidence collected in 1970 could speak in 2023. A biological trace that had been silent for 50 years could suddenly point toward a living family tree. And Pamela's case was about to enter that new era. The evidence from the original investigation had not vanished. Investigators had preserved biological material collected from the crime scene and from Pamela's clothing and person. Those samples would eventually become central to the renewed investigation. Modern testing could extract and analyze DNA in ways the original detectives could never have imagined. The case was no longer confined to the technology of 1970. It had entered the 21st century. And somewhere inside those old samples was a genetic signal. A signal connected to a person. A person connected to a family. a family connected to a name. But identifying a suspect is not the same thing as proving every detail of a murder. Investigators still had to work carefully. They had to establish the connection. They had to corroborate it. They had to determine what the genetic evidence meant. They had to separate fact from possibility. And they had to confront one devastating reality. The man eventually identified was already dead. Forrest Clyde Williams III had died in Virginia in 2018, years before investigators publicly identified him as a suspect. He could not be arrested. He could not be interrogated. He could not stand in a courtroom and answer the questions that had followed Pamela's death for more than 50 years. But the evidence could still speak. In March 2023, Arundel County Police announced that Williams had been identified as a suspect in Pamela Conyers' homicide through advances in DNA technology and forensic genetic genealogy. If he had been alive, investigators said, he would have been charged with Pamela's murder. The announcement stunned the community. More than 5 decades had passed. The name of the girl had remained. The name of the suspected killer had finally emerged. But the story did not end there. Because investigators kept looking. Donald Willard. He was also deceased. 2 names had now surfaced from an investigation that had once seemed almost impossible to solve. 2 men. 1 16-year-old victim. 1 crime scene. And a question that had survived for more than half a century. What exactly happened to Pamela Conyers on that October night? The answer was closer than anyone in 1970 could have imagined. It had been waiting inside evidence that time had failed to erase. And when investigators finally opened that door, they discovered that the past had not forgotten Pamela. It had simply been waiting for the technology to speak. For 52 years, Pamela Conyers existed in the memories of the people who had known her, in an old-school yearbook, in photographs preserved by family members, and in the files of the Arundel County Police Department. But the crime itself remained trapped in October 1970, locked inside a world that no longer existed. The roads changed. The buildings changed. The technology changed. The investigators changed. Pamela did not. She remained 16 years old. And somewhere inside evidence collected more than half a century earlier, there was information that had survived every change around it. The first investigators had done what investigators of that era could do. They processed the vehicle. They examined the location where Pamela's body was discovered. They collected physical evidence. They documented what they could. They sent Pamela's body for a post-mortem examination. The medical examiner determined that she had died from asphyxiation caused by strangulation. The manner of death was homicide. There was no ambiguity. Someone had killed her. But identifying a cause of death was only the beginning. The harder question was the identity of the person responsible. And that question refused to answer. The car became one of the most important pieces of the investigation. Pamela had been driving it when she disappeared. It was later recovered in a wooded area near Mountain Road and Route 100, where the road was under construction at the time. Then, on October 20th, Pamela's body was found a short distance away. The geography mattered. Investigators had to consider how Pamela had arrived there. Who had access to the area? Who knew the construction zone? Who could have moved through the area without attracting attention? Who had seen Pamela that night? And who might have been close enough to her to leave behind evidence? The answers were buried beneath decades of uncertainty. There was no convenient surveillance footage. No smartphone location history. No digital trail. No automated license plate reader. No online social network documenting who had been where. In 1970, a person's movements could simply disappear. A car could travel down a road without being recorded. A meeting could happen without a text message. A stranger could cross paths with a teenager and leave almost no immediately searchable trace. That was the world in which Pamela's killer operated. and that world made the investigation brutally difficult. But the case did not disappear immediately. Detectives worked it. Evidence was preserved. Leads were examined. Questions were asked. Years passed. The murder became one of those cases that seemed destined to remain unanswered. Then something changed. Science changed. In the 1980s and 1990s, DNA began transforming criminal investigations. Biological material that once had limited forensic value could suddenly become an identifying signature.
Blood.
Saliva. Skin cells. Other biological traces. The smallest fragments of human biology could potentially connect a crime scene to a person. For Pamela's case, evidence collected back in 1970 suddenly had a new significance. The material had been there all along, waiting. In 1996, investigators processed DNA evidence associated with the case. That was a major turning point, even though it did not immediately produce a name. The technology could tell investigators that an unknown male profile existed. But an unknown profile was still unknown. It was like having a fingerprint without a database. The evidence could describe the person genetically without telling investigators who he was. And that distinction became the central obstacle. The profile was there. The suspect was not. Decades continued to pass. Pamela's classmates grew older.
Some married.
Some moved away. Some raised families. Some eventually died. The world that had existed around Pamela's disappearance slowly disappeared itself. But the evidence remained. Then the 21st century brought another revolution. DNA databases expanded. Computers became capable of processing enormous amounts of genetic information. And a new investigative technique emerged. Forensic genetic genealogy. Instead of searching only for an exact match inside a traditional criminal DNA database, investigators could search for genetic relationships. A distant cousin could become a clue. A family connection could become a pathway. A surname could emerge from a branch of a family tree. A person who had never been suspected of any crime could unknowingly provide the genetic link that brought investigators closer to someone who had been dead for decades. It was a completely different way of looking at an old murder. The question was no longer simply, who does this DNA belong to? The question became, who is genetically connected to this DNA? That difference could turn an impossible case into an investigative roadmap. And Pamela's case was about to become one of those cases. Cold case investigators revisited the evidence. The old samples were no longer viewed through the limitations of 1970. They were viewed through modern science. The investigation became a collaboration. And Arundel County detectives worked with federal investigators, including the FBI and forensic specialists. The evidence was examined again. The goal was not merely to create another laboratory report. The goal was to turn an anonymous genetic profile into an actual identity. But genetic genealogy is not magic. It does not produce a name instantly. It can produce relatives, connections, possibilities, investigative leads. From there, detectives still have to work. They must construct family trees. Eliminate people. Compare ages. Compare locations. Examine histories. Check timelines. Determine whether a candidate could realistically have been connected to the crime. Then comes the hardest part. Corroboration. A genetic genealogy lead is a starting point. Investigators must establish that the person identified could actually have been involved. In Pamela's case, the search eventually led to a man named Forrest Clyde Williams III. Williams had been born in 1948. That meant he was 21 years old when Pamela was killed. He had connections to the area. His family had moved to Maryland when he was younger. He had attended Unn and Arundel County High School. He later returned to Virginia. And there was something else. Williams was no longer alive. He had died in Virginia in 2018, 5 years before investigators publicly identified him. That created a strange collision between past and present. The investigators had finally found the person they believed was responsible, but the suspect could not be arrested, could not be questioned, could not be confronted with the evidence, could not explain where he had been on October 16, 1970, could not deny knowing Pamela, could not tell investigators whether anyone else had been involved. The man was gone. The mystery was not. On March 10, 2023, authorities publicly announced the breakthrough. Forrest Clyde Williams III had been identified as a suspect in Pamela Conyers' murder. The announcement traveled quickly. A case that had been cold for more than half a century suddenly had a name attached to it. But authorities were careful. They did not describe a courtroom verdict. There had been no trial. Williams was deceased. Police said that if he were alive, he would have been charged with Pamela's murder. That distinction mattered. A suspect is not a convicted killer. The evidence had led investigators to Williams. But the justice system would never have the opportunity to test the full case against him in court. And there was another complication. Investigators had not ruled out the possibility that someone else had been involved. That possibility would become more important than almost anyone outside the investigation realized. Because the DNA evidence was not telling a simple story. There appeared to be another unknown male profile connected to the evidence. Another genetic signal. Another unanswered identity. For decades, investigators had been looking for one killer. Now the evidence was suggesting that they might need to look for two. That changed the entire shape of the case. Imagine the investigators opening the old case file again. The photographs. The reports. The evidence records. The old names. The old locations. And now, beside them, modern genetic information. One profile connected to Williams. Another profile still unidentified. The past was no longer a single locked door. It was becoming a corridor. And there were more doors inside it. The discovery raised an unsettling possibility. Had Pamela been attacked by one person or more than one? Had someone assisted the killer? Had two men encountered Pamela that night? Was one directly responsible for her death, while another played some other role? Or could the second DNA profile have another explanation? Investigators could not simply assume. Every possibility had to be tested. That is where cold case investigations become different from the crimes of yesterday. The passage of time creates both weakness and strength. Witness memories fade, but biological evidence can remain.
People die.
But family trees continue. Buildings disappear, but records survive. The crime scene can be transformed by roads and development, but microscopic evidence can remain frozen in an evidence room. Pamela's case had survived because the physical evidence had survived. And now investigators had to see how far that evidence could take them. The first breakthrough had been Forrest Clyde Williams III. But Williams was not the end of the investigation. He was the beginning of another question.
Who was the second man?
And why was his genetic profile connected to the same murder? Investigators would eventually turn to another specialist laboratory. Othram. The goal was ambitious. Take evidence that had been collected in 1970. Take biological material that had already been examined. Push the technology further. Extract as much usable genetic information as possible. And develop a profile that could be used for forensic genetic genealogy. The laboratory work was not a dramatic television moment. There was no flashing computer screen revealing a killer's face. No instant match. No single button. It was science. Extraction. Sequencing. Analysis. Interpretation. and patience. The kind of work that can take an old piece of evidence and ask it a new question. What else can you tell us? That question would eventually produce another name. Donald Willard. A man formerly from Montgomery County, Maryland. Like Williams, Willard was already dead. He had died in 2010 at the age of 74. He could not be arrested. He could not be interrogated. He could not face Pamela's family. But investigators believed the evidence connected him to the murder. And suddenly, the story that had begun with one missing 16-year-old girl had become something far more disturbing. 2 deceased men. 2 genetic investigations. 1 murder. 1 victim. More than 50 years of silence. And still no courtroom.
No confession. No final testimony.
Only evidence. Only reconstruction. Only the painstaking work of investigators trying to understand what happened on one October night in 1970. For Pamela's classmates, the revelation was powerful. Some had carried the memory of her disappearance for their entire lives. One former classmate remembered an image from the Monday after she vanished. Pamela's empty desk. A space where a 16-year-old girl should have been sitting. A classroom still operating normally while something terrible had happened outside it. That image may be one of the most haunting details in the entire story. Because murder investigations are often reduced to dates. October 16th. October 19th. October 20th. 1970. 1971. 1972. 1973. But Pamela's life was not a timeline. It was a person. A girl with classmates. A family. A school desk. A car. Plans for the weekend. A future that should have continued. Instead, that future stopped. And the investigation became the thing that continued. For decades. The strange power of the case lies in that contradiction. Pamela's life ended in days. The search for the truth lasted generations. When Williams was identified, investigators finally had a name. When Willard was identified, they had another. But names do not automatically reconstruct a crime. They do not tell us every movement, every conversation, every decision, every minute. And because both men were dead, the final answers could never come directly from them. That left investigators with the evidence. And evidence has its own language. Sometimes it whispers. Sometimes it points. Sometimes it creates more questions than answers. The DNA evidence had spoken loudly enough to identify men who had been invisible for decades. But now another question emerged from the silence. If 2 men were responsible, what exactly was their role? And what happened to Pamela during those final hours? That was the question investigators still had to confront. Because solving the identity of a suspect is not the same as reconstructing the entire crime. And in Pamela Conyers' case, the deeper investigators went, the more the story seemed to reveal another layer. The case was no longer simply about finding a name. It was about understanding what that name meant. And somewhere between the old construction site, the abandoned vehicle, the evidence collected in 1970, and the genetic profiles developed more than 5 decades later, the outline of that night was beginning to emerge. But the outline was still incomplete. There were gaps. There were unanswered questions. And there was one fact that remained impossible to change. Pamela had been 16. She should have gone home that night. She never did. The second name changed the investigation. For more than 50 years, Pamela Conyers' murder had been viewed through a single question: who killed her? Now investigators had 2 men. Forrest Clyde Williams III. Donald Willard. Both deceased. Both identified through an investigation that had crossed generations. And neither could ever stand in a courtroom and tell the world what happened. That left the evidence to speak for them. But evidence does not speak in complete sentences. It speaks in fragments. A biological trace. A location. A timeline. A connection.
A name.
And sometimes, one fragment creates another question. The first breakthrough had come in March 2023. And Arundel County Police announced that forensic genetic genealogy had helped identify Forrest Clyde Williams III as a suspect in Pamela's murder. Authorities said Williams was deceased and that, had he been alive, he would have been charged with the crime. It was a remarkable development. But behind the headline was years of work. The evidence had first been collected in 1970. Pamela's body had been processed. The vehicle had been processed. Items associated with the crime scene had been collected. The evidence entered an era when investigators were still working with methods that now seem primitive compared with modern forensic science. Then DNA technology arrived. Suddenly, biological evidence could become an identifying tool. But even that was not enough. A DNA profile without a known match can remain anonymous. It can tell investigators that a particular person contributed biological material. It does not necessarily tell them the person's name. That was the wall the investigation kept hitting. Until genealogy gave investigators another way around it. Instead of searching only for the person themselves, investigators could search for biological relatives. The logic was simple but powerful. A person's DNA is inherited. Families leave genetic patterns behind. If investigators can identify relatives connected to an unknown profile, they may be able to work backward through generations until a possible suspect emerges. But the process is painstaking. A genetic relationship is not proof of guilt. It is a lead. Investigators must build. They must eliminate. They must verify. They must compare. They must ask whether the person identified was alive at the right time, whether he lived in the right region, whether he could have encountered the victim, whether other evidence supports the connection. That is how a cold case begins to move again.
Slowly.
Quietly. Without the dramatic certainty that television often promises. And in Pamela's case, the trail eventually pointed toward Forrest Clyde Williams III. Williams had been born in 1948. In October 1970, he was 21. Pamela was 16. The age difference was significant. But age alone meant nothing. Investigators needed more. They needed to know whether Williams could have been connected to the crime. The investigation revealed that he had ties to and Arundel County. He had attended high school there. His family had moved to Maryland when he was young. He later moved to Virginia. The pieces were beginning to fit. But then came one of the strangest moments in the entire investigation. Williams was dead. He had died in Virginia in 2018, 5 years before police publicly identified him as a suspect. The detectives had arrived at the right name too late. The suspect could not be questioned. The suspect could not be arrested. The suspect could not be brought before a judge. There would be no interrogation room. No detective placing a photograph on a table. No question repeated across hours of questioning. No final statement. The person who might have possessed the missing explanation was already beyond reach. And yet the case continued. Because investigators did not stop with Williams. They looked deeper. The evidence was still there. The biological material was still there. And somewhere within it, another story was waiting. This is where Pamela's case becomes especially unsettling. The first suspect identification could have been treated as the final chapter. A 53-year-old mystery.
A name.
A dead suspect.
Case closed.
But investigators did not treat it that way. The cold case unit continued working. The FBI remained involved. The Maryland Attorney General's office continued assisting. Traditional investigative methods were combined with forensic genetic genealogy. And eventually another name emerged: Donald Willard. He was also deceased. He had formerly been from Montgomery County, Maryland. He had died in 2010. The age of the case suddenly became impossible to ignore. Pamela had been murdered in 1970. Willard died in 2010. Williams died in 2018. Yet investigators were still reconstructing their possible connection to Pamela decades after her death. The investigation had become a conversation between evidence from three different eras: 1970, 1971, 1972, and the present. The crime itself had happened in a world without the technology now being used to investigate it. That contrast is almost impossible to comprehend. Imagine the original evidence sitting in storage, decade after decade. The people who collected it could never have imagined the tools that would eventually examine it. The scientists of 1970 could not have anticipated modern sequencing. The detectives could not have anticipated forensic genetic genealogy. The family could not have known that the evidence would still matter 50 years later. But it did. The evidence waited. And when investigators finally returned to it, the question was no longer simply whether DNA existed. The question was what modern science could extract from it. That distinction became crucial, because DNA evidence can survive. But its usefulness depends on technology. And technology evolves. What was impossible in 1970 may become routine decades later. What was inconclusive in 1996 may become highly informative in the 2020s. That is the strange mathematics of a cold case. Time can destroy evidence. But sometimes time improves the tools used to understand it. Pamela's case had survived long enough to benefit from that second possibility. The old evidence was given new life. And the investigators followed it. But the investigation still faced a fundamental problem. What exactly had happened between Pamela leaving the Herondale shopping area and the discovery of her body? That period was the missing bridge. The last known movement. The disappearance. The abandoned vehicle. The wooded area. The body. Somewhere inside that sequence was the murder. But there was no surviving video showing the attack. No digital record. No GPS trail. No social media post. No cell phone tower history. The investigators had to reconstruct the past using fragments. Pamela had gone to the shopping center at approximately 8:30 p.m. She did not return. Her family reported her missing. 3 days later, her vehicle was found. The next day, her body was discovered. That is what the official timeline tells us. But a timeline does not tell us what Pamela experienced. It does not tell us what she saw, what she heard, who approached her, whether she recognized the person, whether she fought, whether she tried to escape, whether she had any warning. Those are the questions that haunt a murder investigation. And when the victim is 16 years old, those questions carry an unbearable weight. Because she was not a mystery. She was a person. She had a life that existed before the crime. A family that expected her to return. A school that expected to see her again. Friends who expected another Monday. Instead, there was an empty place. And then there was a funeral. And then the years. The case became part of the county's history. But for Pamela's family, history was never abstract. It was personal. Every birthday that passed. Every anniversary. Every year that ended without an answer. The world kept moving. The case did not. Then 2023 arrived. And suddenly, a name appeared. Forrest Clyde Williams III. For the first time in more than 50 years, Pamela's family could look at the investigation and see something that had not been there before. A possible perpetrator. But that discovery came with an emotional contradiction. A suspect had been identified. Yet there could be no prosecution.
No courtroom. No sentence.
No moment of judgment. The man investigators believed responsible had already died. Justice and identification had arrived at different times. One had arrived too late. And the investigation still had unfinished business. That unfinished business became Donald Willard. In March 2024, and Arundel County Police announced the identification of Willard as a second suspect. Investigators said traditional investigative methods and forensic genetic genealogy had contributed to the identification. The department also acknowledged the assistance of the FBI, Maryland Attorney General's Office, Othram Labs, Parabon Nanolabs, and its own forensic units. The announcement was another shock, because now the story was no longer about one suspected offender. There were two. But investigators did not publicly provide every answer. And that is important. The existence of two identified suspects does not automatically establish every detail of the crime. It does not tell us precisely who did what. It does not provide a complete minute-by-minute reconstruction. It does not replace a trial. The official language remained careful.
Suspects.
Not convicted killers. That distinction matters because Pamela's story is real. And when a real person's murder is turned into a dramatic narrative, speculation can easily become mistaken for fact. The evidence has to remain at the center. What is known is devastating enough. Pamela disappeared after leaving for an ordinary errand. Her car was found 3 days later in a wooded area near Mountain Road and Route 100, where the road was under construction. Her body was found nearby the following day. Her death was determined to be a homicide caused by asphyxiation due to strangulation. Decades later, DNA evidence and forensic genetic genealogy helped investigators identify Williams and then Willard as suspects. Both men were dead. Those are the facts. Everything beyond them must be treated carefully, because the gaps are where speculation grows. And Pamela's case has enormous gaps. What happened after she left the shopping center? How did she encounter the men investigators later identified? Why was her vehicle abandoned where it was? Why was her body left nearby? What was the exact role of each suspect? Were there other people who knew what happened? Did anyone remain silent? Did anyone hear something that seemed insignificant at the time? Did anyone see Pamela after she left the shopping center, but never realize the importance of that encounter? These questions have survived because the answers were never recorded. And perhaps the most haunting question of all is simpler. Did Pamela know the people who killed her? There is no publicly established answer that resolves that question completely. The killer did not leave behind a confession. The witnesses did not provide a final explanation. The original investigation could not close the gaps. The modern investigation could identify suspects, but not resurrect the dead. So the case remains trapped between certainty and uncertainty. Investigators can say that Williams was identified as a suspect. They can say that Willard was identified as another suspect. They can say that forensic evidence played a central role. But they cannot ask the two men what happened. And that is the cruelest limitation of a cold case solved too late. The dead cannot defend themselves. They cannot confess. They cannot contradict the evidence. They cannot reveal what investigators may still be missing. The only voice left belongs to the evidence. And evidence has no emotions. It does not care how long Pamela's family waited. It does not care how many birthdays passed. It does not care that the investigation outlived the original detectives. It simply remains a trace, a profile, a connection,
a name.
For Pamela, that evidence became a bridge across 50 years. For investigators, it became the difference between an anonymous killer and identified suspects. For her family, it meant something even more complicated. After decades of uncertainty, they finally had names. But names could not bring Pamela back. They could not return her to her classroom. They could not put her behind the wheel of the car again. They could not erase October 16th, 1970. They could only change one part of the story. For 50 years, the question had been, who? Now investigators had answers. But another question remained. Why did it take so long? The answer was not simply that investigators failed. It was that forensic science had not yet caught up with the evidence. The technology did not exist. The databases did not exist. The genetic genealogy methods did not exist. The computational power did not exist. The investigative possibilities of 2024 were unimaginable in 1970. And yet the evidence had survived the wait. That is what makes Pamela Conyers' case different from many forgotten cold cases. It was not completely silent. It had been whispering for decades. Investigators simply did not yet have the language to understand what it was saying. Now they did. But even after the names emerged, the silence was not completely broken. Because there was still no confession. No trial.
No verdict. No final courtroom reconstruction.
Only a 16-year-old girl whose life ended beside a road that has long since changed. Only an old case file that refused to disappear. Only biological evidence preserved across generations. And two men whose names emerged from that evidence after both were already dead. The mystery had changed. It was no longer a nameless shadow. It had faces. It had identities. But identity was not the same as closure. And for Pamela's family, that distinction mattered. Because closure is not simply knowing a suspect's name. Closure is understanding what happened. It is knowing why. It is knowing how. It is knowing whether every person responsible has been identified. And it is knowing that nothing important remains hidden. For Pamela Conyers, more than 5 decades passed before investigators could place names beside the evidence. Yet even now, the most important person in the story remains the girl whose name was on the original missing person report. Pamela Lynn Conyers. 16 years old. Gone on a Friday night. Found 4 days later. Remembered for more than half a century. Her case had survived because someone kept the evidence. Because investigators kept looking. Because science changed. And because eventually the past gave up 2 names. But the final shape of that night still remained incomplete. The road was quiet. The evidence was old. The suspects were dead. And somewhere between what investigators could prove and what they could never recover, the truth of October 16th, 1970 remained suspended. Not forgotten. Not erased. Waiting. The old evidence had survived. That was the first miracle. The second was that investigators were willing to ask it new questions. In 1970, the evidence had been collected because detectives knew a murder had occurred. They did not know that decades later, those same samples might become the key to identifying people who had escaped suspicion for most of their lives. The evidence was not dramatic. There was no single object that seemed to announce the killer's identity. Instead, there were biological traces. Small fragments. Material that could be preserved without anyone understanding how important it might eventually become. Pamela's clothing. Evidence associated with her body. Evidence recovered from the scene. Pieces of a crime that had been separated from the original investigation and preserved through time. And Arundel County Police later confirmed that DNA was extracted from evidence collected in 1970, including evidence from the scene and from Pamela's clothing and person. Advances in technology, combined with forensic genetic genealogy, eventually helped investigators identify Forrest Clyde Williams III. But there was a long road between a biological sample and a man's name. And that road began with an uncomfortable realization. The old investigation had reached the limits of its era. The detectives of 1970 were not working with today's technology. They could photograph. They could fingerprint. They could interview. They could examine physical evidence. They could build timelines. They could compare statements. But the microscopic world inside human DNA was still largely beyond the practical reach of criminal investigations. That would change. And when it did, Pamela's case changed with it. The first generation of DNA testing brought an entirely new possibility. Instead of asking whether two pieces of evidence looked similar, investigators could compare genetic profiles. A biological sample could become a sequence of markers. A sequence could become a profile. A profile could become a comparison. And eventually, a comparison could become an identification. But there was a problem. What happens when there is no match? What happens when the DNA profile belongs to someone who has never entered a law enforcement database? The answer is simple. You have evidence, but you still do not have a name. That problem has defeated countless investigations. A forensic unknown can be incredibly powerful and almost completely useless at the same time. It can prove that a particular person contributed biological material. It can distinguish one person from another. But unless that profile can be connected to an identity, investigators are still staring at a blank space. For Pamela's investigators, that blank space remained for years. The profile existed. The killer did not have a name. Then genealogy changed the rules. Imagine a family tree stretching backward through generations. Parents. Grandparents. Great-grandparents. Cousins. Distant branches. People who may never have met. People who may never even know that they are genetically connected. Now, imagine placing an unknown DNA profile somewhere inside that tree. The task becomes one of elimination. Find relatives. Find shared ancestors. Construct branches. Remove impossible candidates. Then move forward. Who was alive? Who lived nearby? Who was the right age? Who had connections to Maryland? Who could plausibly have crossed paths with Pamela? It is not a shortcut. It is a maze. And every wrong branch can consume time. But unlike the original investigation, this maze had a map. DNA. The genetic material carried a history. And that history could potentially lead investigators backward through time. That was what happened in Pamela's case. The technology did not travel backward. The evidence did. The evidence had remained in the physical world while science advanced around it. And suddenly, something collected in 1970 could be analyzed using techniques that did not exist when Pamela was alive. That is the paradox of cold cases. The crime gets older. The evidence sometimes gets more valuable. Forrest Clyde Williams III eventually emerged from that process. He was not a name investigators had simply pulled from an old list. He was a person connected through a combination of genetic genealogy and traditional investigative work. And his background mattered. Williams had Maryland connections. He had attended high school in Anne Arundel County. He had been born in 1948. That meant he was 21 when Pamela was murdered. The age fit. The geography raised questions. The genetic evidence created the connection. And the investigators continued digging. This is where a cold case detective has to resist the temptation to celebrate too early. A name is exciting. A name is powerful. A name can make a decades-old investigation feel suddenly alive. But a name can also create tunnel vision. Once investigators believe they have found the answer, every other piece of evidence can begin to look like confirmation. That is dangerous. The responsible approach is the opposite. Test the name. Challenge the name. Try to disprove the name. Look for contradictions. Ask whether the person could have been there. Ask whether the evidence makes sense. Ask whether another explanation fits better. Because the objective is not to find someone who could have committed the crime. The objective is to determine whether the evidence supports that person as the suspect. In Pamela's case, the investigation continued. And then came the most frustrating fact of all. Williams was dead. He had died in Virginia in 2018. The man investigators believed was responsible could never be brought into custody. There would be no arrest photograph from the Pamela Conyers case.
No booking. No interrogation. No arraignment.
No trial.
No jury.
The investigation had reached a person who could no longer be confronted. Yet the identification still mattered. It changed the historical record. For more than 50 years, Pamela's murder had belonged to an unknown offender. Now there was a named suspect. And authorities made a careful statement. If Williams were alive, he would have been charged with Pamela's murder. Those words carried enormous weight. But they also carried a boundary. Williams was a suspect, not a person convicted in court. That distinction is essential. The investigation had produced a conclusion strong enough for police to identify him publicly as a suspect. But because he had died, there was no criminal trial to establish guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. The case therefore entered an unusual space. Investigatively advanced. Legally unfinished. Emotionally enormous. And then the investigators did something that made the case even more complicated. They kept looking. They did not stop with Williams. The cold case unit continued reviewing evidence. The FBI remained involved. The Office of the Maryland Attorney General continued assisting. Forensic laboratories were brought into the process. And eventually, another unknown genetic connection demanded attention. There was another man. Another name. Another life that had existed around the time Pamela was murdered. Donald Willard. The announcement of Willard's identification came in 2024. According to and Arundel County Police, after Williams had been identified, the Cold Case Unit, FBI, and Maryland Attorney General's Office continued investigating. Traditional investigative methods and forensic genetic genealogy ultimately led to the identification of Willard as a second suspect. The word second changed everything. Because now investigators had to consider a possibility that had not been fully resolved before. There might have been more than one person connected to the crime. But again, caution was necessary. Two suspects do not automatically mean two killers. The existence of a second suspect does not by itself explain the exact sequence of events. It does not establish what each person did. It does not prove that both men were physically present during every stage of the crime. It does not tell us whether one person acted directly while another played some other role. Those are questions that require evidence. And evidence from 1970 has limits. Still, the identification of Willard was extraordinary. He had died in 2010, 14 years before authorities publicly identified him as a suspect. Again, the investigators had arrived too late for prosecution. The pattern was becoming almost surreal. Williams was dead. Willard was dead. The victim had been dead for more than half a century. And the investigation was still moving. 3 lives from 3 different points in time were now connected through a single case file. Pamela. Williams. Willard. The years between them seemed enormous. But DNA had compressed those years. A sample collected in 1970 could point toward a man who died in 2010. Another connection could point toward a man who died in 2018. The The evidence had crossed decades that no living investigator could physically cross. And that raises a strange question. What would Pamela have thought if she could have seen the investigation decades later? She would have been an adult. Perhaps married. Perhaps with children. Perhaps living somewhere far from Maryland. Perhaps following a completely different career. No one knows. Those possibilities are painful precisely because they are ordinary. There was nothing about Pamela's life that suggested it should become a historical case. She was 16. She went to school. She drove a car. She ran errands. She lived inside the ordinary rhythms of teenage life. And then one ordinary night became extraordinary. Her family expected her home. She did not arrive. The next morning became a search. The next days became a nightmare. Then the nightmare became an investigation. The investigation became a cold case. And the cold case became a generational mystery. The names of investigators changed. The technology changed. The physical landscape changed. But the question remained. Who killed Pamela Conyers? For decades, the answer was simply unknown. Then came Williams. Then Willard. And yet the answer still contained a blank space. Because a suspect's name does not automatically reconstruct the crime. There were still details that investigators could not recover. The original witnesses might have died. People who knew the suspects might have forgotten conversations from 50 years earlier. People who knew something might never have understood its significance. A person could remember seeing a car. A person could remember hearing an argument. A person could remember someone behaving strangely. But if that memory had never been reported, it could disappear with the person who carried it. That is another enemy of cold case investigations. Not evidence. Not technology.
Time.
Time removes people. Time changes memories. Time destroys context. Time turns living witnesses into photographs. And sometimes it takes the truth with them. The original detectives were trying to solve a murder in the present. Modern detectives were trying to solve a murder that had become history. Those are two different challenges. In 1970, an investigator could knock on a door and speak with someone who had seen Pamela that evening. In 2024, that person might be gone. In 1970, detectives could ask Pamela's classmates what they remembered. Decades later, those classmates might struggle to distinguish one Friday night from another. In 1970, an investigator could examine the surrounding area while it still looked the way it had on the night of the murder. Decades later, development had transformed the landscape. The physical environment itself had become another witness that had aged. But the DNA had not aged in the same way. It did not forget. It did not confuse October 16th with another date. It did not misremember a face. It simply preserved biological information. That is why forensic science became so important to Pamela's story. The technology did not create the evidence. It revealed information that had already been there. And that distinction is crucial. The investigators of 1970 had not failed because they lacked intelligence. They were operating within the limits of their time. The investigators of the 21st century were standing on the shoulders of decades of scientific development. What one generation could not identify, another could. That does not diminish the original investigation. It explains why cold cases sometimes require generations to solve. A case can be unsolved not because there is no evidence, but because the available evidence cannot yet answer the question. Pamela's case is a powerful example. The answer was not found by discovering a magical new piece of evidence. It was found by re-examining old evidence with new tools. That difference is everything. The murder scene had not changed. The biological material had not suddenly appeared. What changed was the ability to interpret it. And as investigators interpreted it, the story became darker. Because the names Williams and Willard were not simply historical names. They were now connected to Pamela through an investigation that had crossed 50 years. Yet the exact nature of that connection still mattered. What did the evidence show? What could it prove? What could it not prove? And what had happened on that road near Mountain Road and Route 100? The official timeline offered only a few fixed points. Pamela left for the Herondale Mall at approximately 8:30 p.m. She did not return. Her family reported her missing. Her vehicle was found 3 days later. Her body was discovered the following day. Between those points was a darkness that lasted more than 50 years. And perhaps that darkness is what makes the case so haunting. There was no final photograph of Pamela walking into the woods. No recording of the moment her life ended. No surviving message explaining where she was going. No final conversation preserved for investigators. Only the aftermath. An abandoned vehicle. A body. Evidence. And a family asking the same question again and again. Where is Pamela? Then, decades later, who did this to her? For years, there was no answer. Now there were names. But names were only the beginning. Because the truth of a murder is not contained in a name. It is contained in actions. And those actions happened in a few hours on a Friday night in 1970. The challenge for investigators was to reconstruct those hours. Not from imagination. Not from assumptions. But from evidence. From what could still be established. From what could still be tested. From what the old case file had preserved. And from what modern science had finally learned to read. The evidence had crossed the first barrier. It had produced identities. But the second barrier remained. What happened? That question was more difficult. Because DNA could point toward people. It could establish biological connections. It could help investigators identify suspects. But it could not, by itself, narrate an entire crime. It could not tell investigators what someone was thinking. It could not explain every movement. It could not recover every conversation. It could not resurrect the final hours of Pamela's life. For that, investigators needed something else. They needed the human story hidden between the forensic facts. They needed the old interviews, the old records, the old photographs, the old memories. They needed to understand who these people were, who Pamela was, who Williams was, who Willard was, and how their paths could possibly have crossed on a Friday night in October. Because the greatest mystery was no longer simply the identity of a killer. It was the connection. Why Pamela? Why that night? Why that location? And why did the truth remain buried for so long? The answers were not waiting in a single laboratory. They were scattered across 50 years. And the investigators were now forced to follow them backward. Back before the DNA. Back before the cold case. Back before the names. Back to the beginning. Back to the girl who left home on October 16, 1970. 16 years old. Driving alone. Heading toward an ordinary errand. And unknowingly approaching the final hours of her life. October 16, 1970, began like an ordinary day. That is one of the most disturbing things about cases like Pamela Conyers. There was no warning that the day would become a date remembered for decades.
No alarm. No headline.
No sense that something terrible was approaching. Pamela was 16. She was living the kind of life that, from the outside, looked completely ordinary.
School.
Friends. Family. A car. Weekend plans. The familiar roads of and Arundel County. The ordinary routine of a teenager. And then, Sometime after she left Glen Burnie High School, that routine broke. The last known movements of Pamela have been reconstructed from the records of the original investigation, but there is still a distance between a timeline and a human experience. A timeline can tell us when she left. It can tell us where her car was found. It can tell us when her body was discovered. But it cannot tell us what Pamela was thinking during those final hours. That is the darkness at the center of the case. The final hours of a victim are often the most important hours in any homicide investigation. Every minute matters. Every location matters. Every person who crossed paths with the victim matters. A stop that seemed insignificant can become crucial. A conversation that seemed ordinary can become the last known interaction. A road that seemed like just another road can become the boundary between a normal life and a crime scene. For Pamela, that boundary was crossed on a Friday night. She had gone to the Herondale shopping area. She was expected to return. Instead, the hours passed. Then the night passed. And Pamela was still gone. For her family, the first hours must have been filled with uncertainty. There is a terrible psychological difference between knowing someone is dead and not knowing where they are. When someone disappears, hope remains. Every telephone call can be the call. Every approaching car might be theirs. Every knock at the door might bring them home. That hope can become its own form of torture. And in 1970, there was no modern communication network capable of instantly broadcasting a missing person's photograph across millions of phones. There was no social media. No online missing person database accessible to the public with a few taps. No digital trail mapping the victim's movements. Investigators had to work through people. Through telephone calls. Through interviews. Through physical searches. Through descriptions. Through whatever witnesses could remember. And while they worked, the clock kept moving. Eventually, Pamela's family reported her missing. The police investigation began. At that moment, the case was still a disappearance. The investigators did not know what had happened. They had to consider every possibility. Maybe Pamela had left voluntarily. Maybe she had gone somewhere with someone. Maybe something had happened to her car. Maybe she was in danger. The possibilities were numerous. But then the vehicle was found. 3 days had passed. The car was located in a wooded area near Mountain Road and Route 100, an area associated with construction at the time. That discovery changed everything. A missing teenager was now connected to an abandoned vehicle. And the location itself raised questions. Why was Pamela's car there? How had it arrived? Who had driven it? Was Pamela inside when it was left? Had someone moved it? Had the vehicle been deliberately abandoned? The car was no longer simply transportation. It had become evidence. Investigators had a physical object that might contain traces of what had happened. The vehicle could tell a story. But like every witness, it could tell only part of it. The next day, October 20th, the search produced the discovery that transformed the investigation permanently. Pamela's body was found a short distance from the vehicle. The missing person case was over. The homicide investigation had begun. She had been strangled. The medical evidence established that her death was a homicide. There was now a crime scene. There was now a victim. There was now a killer. But the killer was nowhere in sight. The investigators had to work backward. What had happened to Pamela? How had she gotten from the shopping area to the location where her car was found? How had the killer gained control of the situation? Was Pamela attacked inside the car? Was she taken somewhere? Did she know her attacker? Was the encounter planned? Or was it spontaneous? Those questions would become part of the case file. Some would be explored. Some would remain unanswered. And some would eventually become even more difficult because the physical world around the crime would change. Construction areas become roads. Empty spaces become buildings. Wooded areas become developed land. A landscape that once seemed permanent can disappear within a generation. But photographs can preserve it. Maps can preserve it. Reports can preserve it. And biological evidence can preserve something even smaller. That microscopic evidence would eventually become the key. But in 1970, the detectives had no way of knowing that. They were working with the tools available to them. They documented the scene. They examined Pamela's body. They processed the vehicle. They collected evidence. They interviewed people. They searched. And somewhere inside that work, material was preserved that would later become central to the investigation. The evidence did not know it was waiting for the future. It simply waited. Years passed. The investigation did not produce the answer everyone wanted. Pamela's killer remained unidentified. The case gradually became a cold case. But cold does not mean forgotten. That distinction matters. A cold case is a case where the investigation has reached a point where no active leads are producing an arrest or prosecution. The file remains. The evidence remains. The questions remain. And sometimes, years later, someone opens the file again. In Pamela's case, that happened more than once. Every new technology created a new opportunity. Every forensic advancement created another reason to look again. DNA became one of the most important. The biological evidence could now be examined at a level that the original investigators could never have imagined. The question became whether there was enough surviving material to produce a usable genetic profile. If there was, the investigation might have something the detectives of 1970 never possessed.
A biological signature.
A way to distinguish one person from another. But a profile alone was not the end. It was only the beginning. An unknown male profile is still an unknown male. The challenge was to connect that profile to an identity. Forensic databases could sometimes produce matches. But what if the killer had never been arrested? What if his DNA had never entered a criminal database? What if he had lived a completely ordinary life after the murder? What if he had never been suspected? Then the conventional DNA search might lead nowhere. That is precisely why genetic genealogy became so important. It changed the question. Investigators no longer had to wait for the killer's DNA to appear in a database. They could search for relatives. That meant the killer could remain unidentified while members of his family unknowingly carried the genetic breadcrumbs that could lead investigators toward him. The technique had already begun changing cold case investigations across the United States. Now Pamela's case entered that world. The biological evidence from 1970 was revisited. The goal was to extract information capable of supporting genealogical research. The science was complicated. The results had to be interpreted carefully. A genetic connection can point investigators toward a family. But a family can contain hundreds of people. Investigators must move through generations. They must identify common ancestors. They must determine which branches lead toward the right region. They must eliminate people who could not have committed the crime. They must consider age. They must consider geography. They must consider whether a candidate had any plausible connection to the victim. And eventually, one branch led toward Forrest Clyde Williams III. Williams was born in 1948. That meant he was 21 when Pamela was killed. The age was compatible. The location was significant. And the genetic evidence provided the connection investigators had been searching for. But there was another layer. Williams was not simply a person who happened to live somewhere in Maryland. He had a connection to Anne Arundel County. He had attended a local high school. His family had moved to Maryland when he was young. The geography was no longer abstract. The investigators were no longer staring at an anonymous DNA profile. They were looking at a man who had existed in the same general world as Pamela. The possibility was chilling. For more than 50 years, his name had not been attached publicly to Pamela's murder. Then modern science placed it there. But investigators still had to examine everything. A genetic lead could not replace traditional detective work. The old case file had to be reopened. The history of Williams had to be examined. His movements.
His background.
His connections.
His timeline.
Everything that could either support or weaken the identification had to be considered. And then came the obstacle that no investigator could overcome. Williams was dead. He had died in Virginia in 2018. The man was gone. But the investigation had finally reached him. That creates a strange kind of unfinished justice. The identity can be discovered. The suspect can be named. But there is no courtroom. There is no opportunity for the accused to respond. There is no cross-examination. There is no jury hearing the evidence. There is no verdict. There is only the conclusion of investigators based on the evidence available to them. That is why authorities carefully described Williams as a suspect. The distinction is not a technical footnote. It is the difference between investigation and adjudication. Pamela's murder was never tried against Williams. He was never convicted. But investigators believed the evidence was strong enough that, had he been alive, he would have faced a murder charge. For the first time, the public could attach a name to the person investigators believed was responsible. After decades of anonymity, the shadow had a shape. But investigators were not finished. Because another genetic trail remained. Another unknown male profile. Another connection. Another question. If Williams had been identified, why was there another man connected to the evidence? The investigation moved forward. And this time, the trail eventually led to Donald Willard. Willard had connections to Maryland. He had lived in Montgomery County. And like Williams, he was already dead. He had died in 2010. Again, the investigators had arrived too late. But the identification was significant. The official announcement in 2024 described Willard as a second suspect in Pamela's homicide. Investigators said the identification resulted from a combination of traditional investigative work and forensic genetic genealogy. aacounty.org, https://www.aacounty.org/police-department/about-us/news/Anne Arundel County Police announced second suspect identified UTM_source sequel /ADETCOM. The word second carried enormous weight. For years, the case had been a search for one unknown killer. Now there were two suspects. And suddenly the investigation had another problem. What did the two men have to do with each other? Was there a connection? Were they friends? Acquaintances? Did they know each other at all? Was one involved directly while the other played another role? Or did the evidence point toward two men for reasons investigators were still trying to understand? The public could speculate. But investigators needed evidence. That is the difference between a documentary narrative and an actual homicide investigation. A story can connect two names in seconds. A detective cannot. A detective must prove the connection. The evidence must survive scrutiny. And in a case this old, every conclusion carries uncertainty. Memories are incomplete. Documents may be missing.
People are dead.
Locations have changed. But the biological evidence remains. And that evidence had already done something extraordinary. It had identified men who had remained outside the public narrative for more than 50 years. That alone changed Pamela's case forever. But it did not answer everything. It did not explain why Pamela was targeted. It did not explain the precise sequence of events. It did not explain every movement between the shopping center and the wooded area. It did not tell investigators what Pamela's final moments were like. And perhaps most painfully, it could not tell Pamela's family why she never came home. That question has no easy forensic answer. Sometimes a case can identify a suspect without revealing motive. Sometimes science can identify a person but cannot reconstruct the entire human story. Pamela's case sits in that space. The evidence has spoken, but it has not said everything. There is another reason the story remains so haunting. The men identified by investigators lived ordinary lives for decades after Pamela's death. At least publicly, they were not known as the suspects in one of Maryland's most enduring cold cases. They aged. They moved. They built lives. They eventually died. Meanwhile, Pamela's family continued living with the absence. That contrast is brutal. For the suspects, time moved forward. For Pamela, time stopped. For her family, time moved but never truly erased the date. Every year carried the same anniversary. October 16th. Then October 20th. The disappearance. The discovery. The beginning of a wound that never completely closed. And when investigators finally announced the names, the reaction could not simply be celebration. Because there is a difference between solving a mystery and restoring a life. Nothing can restore Pamela. No forensic breakthrough can return her to 16 and send her home that night. No suspect identification can give her family the decades they lost. No headline can rewrite the ending. The only thing the investigation can do is narrow the darkness. For 50 years, the darkness contained an unknown person. Then Williams emerged. Then Willard. The darkness became smaller. But it did not disappear completely. Because the final truth still depends on questions that may never be answered. And perhaps the most important question is one investigators cannot ask anymore. What happened that night? If Williams could speak, what would he say? If Willard could speak, what would he say? Would their answers agree? Would either reveal another person? Would either explain why Pamela's car was abandoned? Would either describe the final moments of a 16-year-old girl? We will never know. Both men died before those questions could be asked in a courtroom. That is the tragedy of this case. The evidence survived. The suspects did not. And the victim's family was left with an answer that is both enormous and incomplete. A name is better than no name. Two names are more than one. But neither can replace testimony. Neither can replace a verdict. Neither can erase uncertainty. The investigation had crossed the first great barrier. It had moved from unknown to identified. Now it faced the second. From identified to understood. And that second journey was harder. Because it required reconstructing a night that no living person could completely remember. A night that began normally. A night that ended in murder. A night that transformed a 16-year-old girl into the center of a mystery that would outlive almost everyone who first investigated it. The road where Pamela's car was found no longer looked exactly as it had in 1970. The construction site was no longer frozen in time. The people who lived nearby had changed. The witnesses had aged. Some had disappeared entirely. But the evidence remained. And the evidence had one final advantage. It could not forget. For more than 50 years, investigators had asked the same question. Now the question had become more precise. Not simply who, but who did what.
And why?
The answers were still hidden. And somewhere inside the old evidence, the old records, the genetic connections, and the memories that survived, the investigators continued searching. Because identifying the suspects had opened the door. It had not closed the case. And behind that door was the night itself. October 16th, 1970. A 16-year-old girl. A shopping trip. A car. A road. A wooded area. And a few missing hours that would become one of the darkest mysteries in Maryland. The clock had been running for more than 50 years. And it still had not reached the end. For more than half a century, the most important evidence in Pamela Conyers' murder case existed in silence. It sat in evidence storage. It existed inside old reports. It survived inside photographs and laboratory records. And most importantly, biological evidence connected to the crime survived long enough to be examined by scientists who had access to tools the original investigators could never have imagined. That is where the case entered its most extraordinary chapter. DNA does not remember a face. It does not remember a voice. It does not remember a conversation. But DNA carries information. And sometimes, that information can survive for decades. In Pamela's case, investigators eventually learned that the biological evidence preserved from the 1970 crime scene contained information capable of pointing toward a male contributor. The breakthrough did not happen overnight. It was the product of years of scientific development and renewed investigative attention. The first generation of DNA analysis had already changed the case. But forensic genetic genealogy pushed the investigation into territory that would have been almost unimaginable in 1970. The basic principles sound simple. If investigators have an unknown DNA profile, they can search for genetic relatives. A distant relative can become a clue. A family connection can become a map. A family tree can become a pathway toward an unknown individual. But the process is anything but simple. A genetic genealogy investigation can begin with a distant relationship and lead through multiple generations. Investigators may find several branches. Most will be irrelevant. Some will lead to families that have no connection to the crime. Others may contain hundreds of possible descendants. The investigator's job is to narrow them.
Age.
Location. Family history. Employment. Residences. Known relationships. Every piece of information matters. And every assumption has to be tested. That is why the identification of Forrest Clyde Williams III was significant. He did not appear from nowhere. The genetic investigation provided a path. A traditional investigative work then helped establish that the path was meaningful. Williams had been born in 1948. He had Maryland connections. He had attended a high school in Anne Arundel County. And in 1970, he was 21 years old. The geography and timeline made him a viable investigative subject. But there was another question. Could the biological evidence actually connect Williams to the crime? That is where forensic testing becomes crucial. Genetic genealogy can identify a possible person. Investigators then need to establish the relationship between that person and the evidence. A genealogical lead is not automatically a criminal identification. It is an investigative bridge. Once investigators crossed that bridge, they had to determine whether Williams could be connected to Pamela's murder. That process took time. The investigation was not simply a computer search. It involved police work, records, laboratory analysis, historical information, and collaboration between agencies. The FBI became involved. The Maryland Attorney General's office assisted. And Arundel County investigators continued examining the case. Forensic specialists analyzed the evidence. The case became a multidisciplinary investigation spanning decades of scientific development. Then, in 2023, the public finally learned the name. Forrest Clyde Williams III. The announcement was extraordinary because the case had been unsolved for more than 50 years. But the announcement also contained a painful limitation. Williams was dead. He had died in 2018. Investigators could identify him. They could reconstruct the evidence. They could state what they believed had happened. But they could not bring him into custody. That meant the investigation could never reach the traditional endpoint. There would be no courtroom confrontation.
No plea.
No trial.
No sentence.
And no opportunity for Pamela's family to hear the suspect explain himself. The law had arrived at the pass too late. But investigators did not stop. That decision became crucial, because the evidence was suggesting there was more to discover. The second male DNA profile remained, and the existence of another profile meant the investigation could not simply be closed after Williams was identified. Investigators needed to know who the other man was. The search began again. Another genetic profile, another family tree, another journey backward through generations. The laboratory work became even more important. Othram, a forensic genomics laboratory, was involved in the investigation. Its role was to help develop genetic information from evidence associated with the case and assist investigators in pursuing genetic genealogy. The science behind this work is complex. DNA must first be recovered. Then scientists need to determine whether enough usable material remains. Degraded DNA can be difficult to analyze. Environmental exposure can damage genetic material. Time can complicate extraction. And old evidence may contain DNA from more than one person. That creates another challenge. A mixed sample can contain genetic contributions from multiple individuals. Scientists must separate what can be separated. They must determine which signals are reliable. They must avoid confusing one contributor with another. The objective is not to create a dramatic answer. The objective is accuracy. Because one mistake can send an investigation down the wrong road. Pamela's case had already waited more than 50 years. There was no reason to rush now. The investigators needed the right answer. Not merely an answer. That distinction is what separates forensic science from speculation. And eventually, the second investigation produced another name. Donald Willard. The identification was announced in 2024. Again, the suspect was deceased. Willard had died in 2010. Again, investigators had reached the person only after he was beyond the reach of the criminal justice system. The timing was almost cruel. The men had lived long lives after Pamela's death. They had grown older while the case remained unresolved. And only after their deaths did modern science connect them to the investigation. That creates a question that cannot be answered. Did either man ever believe the case would be solved? Did either man know that biological evidence connected him to Pamela? Did either man fear that investigators might one day come back? No one can know. The only thing investigators could do was examine the evidence. And the evidence pointed toward two suspects. That changed the public understanding of Pamela's murder. For decades, the killer had been an unknown figure. Now there were identities. But the identities raised another problem. If two men were connected to the case, what was their relationship to one another? The official announcements did not provide a complete public reconstruction of every detail. That matters. A responsible account cannot fill those gaps with invented scenes. The investigation has to be described according to what is known. And what is known is already extraordinary. Pamela was murdered. Biological evidence survived. Modern forensic science extracted usable information. Genetic genealogy generated investigative leads. Traditional police work followed those leads. Williams was identified. Then Willard was identified. Both were dead. The case remained without a criminal trial. That is the factual framework. Everything else must be treated as a question. And there are many questions. Why was Pamela targeted? Was she targeted specifically? Was the encounter random? Did she know her killer? Was her vehicle used to transport her? Was it abandoned at the location intentionally? Did the person who killed her know the area? Was the construction zone chosen because it offered privacy? Did someone see something that night? And if they did, why did that information never produce an arrest? The answers may have existed in 1970. They may have been hidden in memories. They may have been recorded in documents that were never connected. They may have disappeared with witnesses. Or they may have never been known. That uncertainty is one of the defining characteristics of a cold case. The investigator is not simply solving a crime. The investigator is fighting time. Time changes landscapes. Time changes technology. Time changes families. Time changes language. Time changes memories. And time kills witnesses. That last factor can be devastating. Imagine someone who saw Pamela that night. Maybe they remembered seeing her car. Maybe they remembered a man standing nearby. Maybe they heard something. Maybe they noticed a vehicle. If that person did not realize the significance, they might never have reported it. Years pass. Decades pass. The person dies. The memory disappears. The evidence that could have solved the case disappears with them. That is why biological evidence is so valuable. It does not require a witness to remember. It does not require someone to understand what they saw. It can exist independently.
Silent.
Objective. Waiting. And Pamela's case is an example of how that can happen. A sample collected in 1970 eventually became part of a modern investigation. The same biological evidence that could not identify a suspect in 1970 could be used decades later to generate genetic leads. The technology had caught up with the evidence. But even the best technology has limitations. DNA can establish relationships. It can help identify individuals. It cannot automatically reveal motive. It cannot tell investigators what a person was thinking. It cannot tell them why Pamela's life was targeted. It cannot recover a lost confession. That is why investigators still needed traditional detective work. The science opened doors. Detectives had to walk through them. They had to examine the people behind the genetic profiles. That meant learning about Williams, learning about Willard, learning where they lived, who they knew, where they went, what connections they had to Maryland, and whether those connections made sense in the context of Pamela's murder. The work was painstaking. The case had existed for so long that every new discovery had to be examined against decades of information. Old reports had to be read again. Old assumptions had to be challenged. Evidence that once seemed unimportant could suddenly become relevant. This is often how cold cases are solved. Not through one brilliant clue, but through accumulation. One fact connects to another. One piece of evidence gives meaning to another. A genetic profile creates a family tree. The family tree produces a name. The name produces a location. The location produces a historical connection. The historical connection produces another lead. And eventually, the anonymous becomes identifiable. That is what happened with Pamela. The process was not glamorous. It was methodical, scientific,
slow.
But the result was dramatic. For more than 50 years, the murder had been associated with uncertainty. Now it had two names attached to it. And yet the case still carried an unusual quality. The suspects could never tell their side. That means the evidence has to carry an even greater burden. Investigators must distinguish between what they know and what they believe. The public must do the same. A suspect identified by police is not the same thing as a person convicted in court. A genetic association can be powerful, but the exact meaning of that association must be understood. And because neither Williams nor Willard could ever be prosecuted, the historical record will always contain an unusual gap. There is an investigative conclusion, but there is no judicial conclusion. There is evidence, but no trial. There are names, but no testimony. There is a murder, but no final confession. That is why Pamela's case remains haunting even after the breakthroughs. The mystery is smaller, but it has not disappeared. For Pamela's family, the discovery of the suspects must have carried complicated emotions. Relief,
Shock.
Anger.
Grief.
Perhaps even disbelief. For decades, the question had been whether anyone would ever know. Then suddenly, investigators were saying they believed they knew. But there is no simple way to process information like that after half a century. Imagine spending years believing the killer might never be identified. Then imagine hearing a name. Then another. The mind immediately wants the next answer. What happened?
Why? How?
What was the relationship? What did the suspects do? But the investigation cannot always provide every answer. Sometimes the evidence stops. And when the evidence stops, the questions remain. That is where Pamela's story stands. Between what science has revealed and what time has erased. Between two names and the full truth. Between an investigation and a conviction. Between the past and the present. And perhaps that is why the case continues to attract attention. Because it demonstrates something both hopeful and disturbing. A murder can remain unsolved for 50 years. But unsolved does not necessarily mean unsolvable. Evidence can wait. Science can advance. Investigators can return. And a name can emerge from a sample collected before modern forensic genetics even existed. Pamela was 16 when she died. She never knew what DNA was. She never knew that decades later, genetic genealogy would help investigators search family trees. She never knew that her case would become a demonstration of how modern forensic science can reach backward through time. But her evidence survived. And because it survived, investigators eventually had something to work with. The road to the truth was not straight. It was 50 years long. It crossed laboratories, police departments, federal agencies, family trees, old records, new technology, and 2 generations of investigators. Yet the central mystery remained anchored to one night. October 16th, 1970. The night Pamela disappeared. The night the ordinary became terrifying. The night that would eventually become a cold case. And perhaps the most painful part is that nothing about Pamela's final evening suggested that history was being made. She was simply living. A teenager going about her life. And somewhere in the darkness, someone entered that life and ended it. More than 50 years later, investigators had finally placed names beside the evidence. But names alone could not reconstruct those final hours. For that, they needed to go deeper. They needed to understand the people, the places, the relationships, the timeline, the evidence, and the unanswered question at the heart of everything. What happened after Pamela left the shopping center? The answer had been buried for decades. But now the investigators had something they had never possessed before. A path. And that path led backward. Toward the men. Toward the evidence. Toward the night. Toward the moment when a 16-year-old girl's ordinary Friday became one of Maryland's most enduring mysteries. And the deeper they went, the more they would discover that the case was never truly silent. It had been speaking all along. The investigators simply had to learn how to listen.